Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started, and those who join late will join in wherever they can. Thank you everyone for joining today for our second JCC Association Jewish Disability Awareness, Acceptance, and Inclusion Month, otherwise known as JDAAIM, which is how I will refer to it for the rest of the session, program on fostering inclusive workplaces. It is so great to have so many people join us today for this conversation about how to make your workplace more inclusive, where to get started, and we are joined by two amazing experts in this area. But first, I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself and my colleague, Liv. For those who don't know me, my name is Sierra Weiss, and I am the Access and Inclusion Specialist for JCC Association. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman wearing glasses today with brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a black blouse. And I am joining from the JCC Association offices in New York City today, which is the traditional land of the Munsee Lenape. And just before I hand it over to my colleague Liv to introduce herself, I just want to do some housekeeping just to make everyone aware. If you would like to have closed captioning during our conversation today, you can use the three dots that say more on your Zoom screen to access those closed captioning. Feel free to turn those on as you want, and also know that this will be recorded for you to view at a later time if there's anything you want to return back to, and the slides will also be available for you to view at any point after the conversation. So thank you for joining us, and Liv, I'll hand it over to you.
Apologies, I'm still letting people in from the waiting room, but I am Liv. I am also a short woman with dark hair, but no glasses, joining you from Toronto, where it's quite snowy today, which is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and the Mississauga of the Credit. And we have excellent speakers today, so I'm thrilled to be here for this program, and kudos to Sierra for putting this event together today.
Thank you, Liv. So I am going to have us dive right in and introduce our wonderful speaker and our moderator for today's conversation. So we are very fortunate to be joined today by Emily Ladau, who is a passionate disability rights activist, writer, storyteller, and digital communications consultant, whose career began at the age of 10 when she appeared on several episodes of Sesame Street to educate children about her life with a physical disability. Her writing has been published in outlets including the New York Times, CNN, Vice, and HuffPost, and her first book, Demystifying Disability, which I have here with me, and it's a beautiful book and one of my favorite resources. It is a teal cover with the title in the middle and images of a multitude of different people with different bodies, and it's just an excellent resource that I highly recommend if you haven't already had a chance to look at it. It was published by 10 Speed Press, an imprint of Penguin Random House, in September of 2021. Emily has spoken before numerous audiences, from the U.S. Department of Education to the United Nations. Central to all of Emily's work is harnessing the power of storytelling to engage people in learning about disability. And Liv, if I could ask you to pin Emily while I introduce our moderator for today's conversation. So our moderator today is Gabrielle Kaplan-Mayer, who is an author and Jewish educator, having worked in various capacities in the field for over 25 years. At Jewish Learning Venture, she works as the Chief Program Officer and directs JLV's Whole Community Inclusion Initiative. She's the proud recipient of the 2022 Covenant Award. Her most recent book, The Little Gatecrasher, is a memoir of her great uncle who overcame society's prejudices about dwarfism to lead a remarkable life. She has also written a journal created for fellow parents raising children with disabilities. Gabby holds a BFA in theater and creative writing from Emerson College and an MA in Jewish studies from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and her writing and online workshops can be found at her website, www.gabriellekaplanmayer.com. And I also want to mention another book that I have on my bookshelf, Warm and Welcoming, How the Jewish Community Can Become Truly Diverse and Inclusive in the 21st Century, in which Gabrielle wrote the chapter specifically focusing on disability inclusion, which is also a beautiful chapter to read, as is the whole book as a resource. So I am so excited to hand it over to these two women to have a conversation kind of in the style of a fireside chat, where Gabrielle will be moderating the conversation with Emily, And then at the end, we will open it up to Q&A with the audience. If you have any questions throughout the conversation, feel free to put them in the chat at any time, and we will answer them later on in the conversation. Or you can wait and feel free at that time to raise your hand virtually or physically, and we will call on you and offer for you to unmute yourself and ask your question. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen so we could focus our attention on Emily and Gabrielle.
Well, thank you so much for this invitation to be here. And I shared privately with Emily before we started that, Emily, I use your book all the time in trainings. It's so clear. It's so well written. It takes so many concepts that can be abstract and hard to digest. And your voice is just so helpful. So first, I guess I want to begin by thanking you for your book.
Well, honestly, I want to say thank you for reading it and considering it so thoughtfully. It's not something I take lightly or for granted, and something that I really value, knowing that I can play that small role in a broader journey.
That is great. Well, to everyone listening, if you haven't read Emily's book, you'll hopefully get it after this session and read it and use it and share it in your community. So as you heard, I'm going to begin. I have some questions to ask Emily. I am a moderator who generally, I get a little sidetracked if I read too many comments while it's all happening. I like to listen to the person I'm talking with. So please dump them in. I may or may not respond or see them, but we will have time at the end for questions and comments. So Emily, recently in an interview that you gave for the URJ, you discussed the Jewish values that inspire your activism. And I'm wondering if you could share for everyone today, what values drive your work and how are they rooted in Jewish community values?
I love this as a starting point because it's really special for me to be able to connect my Jewish identity with my disability identity. And I just wanted to give a quick note that what you're not able to visualize in the screen today is that I am a wheelchair user. And so disability is very much part of my physical presence and the space that I occupy. But interestingly enough, it's something that I end up disclosing when I am in Zoom spaces, which I don't necessarily do when I am in person. And so I just wanted to make sure that people have that context. And now that I've shared that I am a disabled Jewish woman, you know, those two identities for me, I didn't realize when I was younger how deeply intertwined they actually are. And I think that's because there was quite a void of conversation in the Jewish communities that I was a part of about disability. And then in the disability communities that I found, there wasn't much conversation about Judaism. And so I have had to find ways to really bridge that gap for myself. And it's still a learning journey that I'm on. But I think that there are two concepts that really resonate for me. And the first one, I think it's really an obvious one, but obviously Tikkun Olam is so important. What really matters most to me is clarifying how I feel about the concept of healing the world, because when we think of healing the world, we often think, okay, we're going to fix problems, we're going to fix people, right? We're going to come up with solutions. But in the world of disability, that concept of healing, that concept of fixing is something that can be incredibly fraught, because as someone who's disabled, I don't want you to take that part of my identity away. I want you to acknowledge it as part of who I am. And so when I'm thinking about healing the world, what I'm thinking about is, let's heal the harmful attitudes that we have. Let's repair the inaccessibility that's within this world. I don't want to be fixed. I want to fix the world around us so that everyone feels like they belong. And so Tikkun Olam really resonates for me. But then diving a little bit deeper, and I wish I could tell you where I heard this quote. I cannot, but it's from the Talmud, and it's, you are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And that quote has resonated with me so deeply in all of the work that I do, because I think that there is this feeling we can all take on at times where we have to carry the weight and we are responsible for making changes alone. And we forget that we succeed only by being in community with each other. And so when I think about this quote, I am reminded I am not alone. Nobody is responsible for bearing that full weight. And I'm part of a much bigger community of people who are doing this work. And so I think about that often, but especially during this month, because I am reminded that there are other people around me who care so deeply about this too. And I hope that we can share in that and really keep building that community together.
Emily, you lift up both of those values are so important. And I think in the work that you do in your book and in this kind of teaching, just for people to take in what you share, that what would it look like to think, rather than fixing, right, that you are someone with a disability, that we can fix the way that our world is designed, environments are designed. We're going to be focusing today talking about the workplace and how just some different changes in the workplace can make all the world of difference. And you know, this concept that there is no way that the work of this can be carried by any one person. And I think too often it can fall on people who have disabilities to do the work. And we're saying, no, that each of us, you know, whether this is your first conversation that you've participated in like this or not, we hope that you'll play a role. And so I want to turn to this idea of the workplace. And of course, we have many JCC folks on this call today. Let's start with sort of a current state of inclusion. How do you see it generally in the workplace for people with disabilities right now?
Well, I think the first thing in answer to that question that I want to name is going back to something that you said about how this is not just work that falls onto the shoulders of the disability community. This is very much collective work. And when we create a world that is more accessible to disabled people, we're ultimately creating a world that is more accessible and better for everyone. So I think that is a really important value to carry forward as we're thinking about the quote unquote state of inclusion as it is currently in our workplaces. And I think the key disconnect that I continue to notice right now is that disability inclusion and inclusion in general is an initiative. It's a separate policy or practice or program that tends to have its own special meetings and special focus. And that's great. I think it's really important that we are focusing in on disability. However, when it is simply the disability inclusion initiative, as opposed to we want to make every part of everything we do accessible and inclusive, I think that some of that gets really lost in translation, because you have the accessibility activists and advocates and the people who are passionate about it, and you have the people who care deeply about making the workplace more inclusive. And then where is that in every other department? How does that translate to every other department? And I think that that is really where we are right now. It's seen as something separate, is seen as a niche. It's seen as something that we do because it's the right thing to do, and not because we're all human beings who deserve to belong. So it's still the good deed, the award-winning program, right? And I don't want anyone to feel like I am being discouraging when I say that, especially if you are part of those programs, those initiatives, right? Because they are essential. But my hope is that we begin to shift away from it just being that separate initiative to being baked in fully into all of the work that we're doing.
It makes so much sense, Emily. I mean, look, it may be for anyone who's listening and thinking like, oh, we just started this, I don't know, disability inclusion committee or this or that. And to say like, oh, okay, cool. It's a first step. And how, what you're talking about, that it will penetrate across everything. Really briefly, like as an example of a workplace thing, our office space isn't an accessible space. Any program space that we do at Jewish Learning Venture, like outside public space programs, we use accessible spaces. We have a fundraiser. We have a big fundraiser every year for, a donor, and it's like a significant part of what supports our work. And, a few years ago, the people who organized that event, and a lot goes into that, were looking for spaces to hold the event. And I was so thrilled because I knew that the work we'd been doing had penetrated and become universal, because they came back to talk about, oh, there was this really beautiful venue and blah, blah, blah. It was stairs only. It was not accessible for, someone who uses a wheelchair, other mobility issues. And it was like, oh, that was nice, but that's off the table. And it was just like that organic thing that had come across in our workplace. And I think that's, what you're pointing towards.
And I love that you brought that up. And I know that this is a workplace conversation, but I think it's really relevant when talking about Jewish life in general, to think about the areas where it's accessible and not accessible. And a story that I share that's not work related, but congregation and community related, is the fact that the synagogue that I went to when I was growing up, the bima was not accessible. There were steps leading up to it. And so for my bat mitzvah, our good friends, my best friend's family, they came together and they built a ramp for me to get up to the bima. And I felt like that was such a powerful moment of being brought into the community and being shown that I am welcome there. But then after my bat mitzvah ceremony, the ramp was taken down and the bima went right back to being inaccessible. And so I think that really kind of illustrates that intersection of Jewish life and disability life, in the sense that, some are welcome, but not all are welcome all the time. And that seems to be the message that tends to go out. We may do something special for you. We may create an initiative for you. It may be something separate that we're dealing with over here, but in day-to-day life, we're not yet at the point where we're thinking about it in the way that we should be. And so my hope is that in all of our communities, secular, Jewish, and otherwise, that we are really taking the time to recognize that this shouldn't be one-off. This needs to be something that we are looking at as a whole.
Yes. I'm going to make one brief departure because it just came up in what you're talking about, Emily, but also the awareness that I think not all of our organizations have and hold in terms of the workplace we're creating, that, disability can happen at any moment in life. And so you may have your staff and the way you work and so forth. And someone's disability status can change because of injury, because of chronic illness, because of so many things that occur. And I mean, I know we're seeing that more with folks who have long COVID, for example, and other things. And so looking at even your workplace, sort of the state of inclusion now, you may be thinking, well, there's no one on our staff who has a disability. And that could change tomorrow.
And it's also quite possible statistically speaking, 1 in 4 adults in the US has some kind of disability, and that's regardless of whether you identify with that term or not. And so there are people in our group right now who have disabilities. There are people in your workplaces who have disabilities. It may just be a matter of not feeling like they can disclose that information because of the culture, because of the environment. And so, there's a real exciting opportunity here to be able to capitalize on that and say, what can we do to make that culture shift?
Thank you. Absolutely. I'm wondering, for anyone listening who's part of an organization who's at the beginning, who really hasn't taken those steps, what are some first steps that you recommend?
Well, I think this is a good chance to make sure that nobody feels too overwhelmed, because I find myself every time I engage in conversation about what changes I would love to see, the reactions go in two directions. It's either, oh my goodness, this is too much, I don't know where to start, so I'm just going to go curl up in a ball in the corner and not deal with it. And then there's the flip side of that, which is like, I am an inclusion champion, we need to make everything accessible right now, let's get to it. And I don't think that either is super effective, because you're either afraid or you're going to burn out. And that's just not sustainable. And so when it comes to thinking about the first steps that you can take, it's really about taking a moment to assess what's already going on around you and to say, what's working, what's not, what gaps can we fill in, what are the opportunities for change, knowing that it's not always going to happen overnight. And so maybe it is something very small that you do. One thing that I recommend is what's known as an access check-in. And so if you have a meeting or if you have a group that meets regularly, taking a moment to say, before we get started, I just want to do an access check-in. I want to know if everybody feels like their needs are being met in this moment. And if they're not, let's take a moment to figure out how we can meet your needs. Or if you're not comfortable sharing it in front of the group, let's talk about it afterwards. But just inviting that conversation is a really, really great first step. To let people know that they're welcome to show up in a space in the way that they need to. And, then of course come the steps of figuring out, is your physical environment accessible? Are your virtual environments accessible? What are the policies and practices that you have in place for accommodations? So yeah, there are logistical things to work out, but I really encourage people to take those first steps at a very human level and to say, we are all people. We all need to ensure that this environment works for us. Let's figure out how to do that together.
Well, thank you. I love that idea of the access check-in. And again, knowing that access needs change for all of us at all times, just to bring that into the culture. And like, we're all here doing the work and we're all humans with needs is very powerful, Emily. I'm wondering about the term allyship and what it means for you and how that plays into our conversation today.
I think this actually connects very well to what we were just talking about, because if you don't identify as having a disability, but you are someone who is compassionate and empathetic and cares about creating an accessible environment, it can be very easy to say, well, I am an ally to the disability community. And my question for people who say that is always, what do you mean by that? Because I think a lot of people view ally as a title that we can give ourselves, where we can just sort of put a name badge on right here that says, hi, my name is Ally. And, then they're looking for that checklist that they can complete, starting at the beginning and ending at the bottom. And when you've checked off all the steps on the checklist, then you get a little trophy that says number 1 ally. And I really relate to wanting that kind of straightforward linear approach to being a supportive ally. But that also means that you're then looking at it more like a project to be done or a task that you have to complete. You're not really looking at the whole person. You're instead looking at the fact that there's things you need to do to accommodate people. It's no longer about that human interaction and connection. And yes, there are checklists that you can follow for how to make an environment more accessible, how to ensure your website and social media are accessible, right? There are tools and resources that you can use, but to be an ally is not about giving yourself a title and then doing something in a very linear way. It's really more of an ongoing journey as opposed to the destination where you've reached the pinnacle of allyship and you're done. And so I think that's the key distinction for me that I try to make when I'm talking about allyship, is that it's not just about calling yourself an ally, it's about taking the action to be an ally. And the other thing I will add to that, which I think is very important, is that none of us are absolved of the work of being an ally just because we hold some kind of a marginalized identity. And so even though I am a disabled Jewish woman, there's still work that I can do to be an ally to other communities. And I'm constantly having to check myself all the time because I continually realize there's just things about my identity and experiences that mean that I will never know what it is like to be a disabled person of color, to be a trans disabled person, right? That's just not my experience. So allyship is a very broad and expansive form of action.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I think again, this idea that it's not a one and done, as you said, it's not a checklist. It's an ongoing experience of learning and growth that we're all in. And I also hear in that the relationship piece is essential. So let's go back a little bit now, Emily, to the workplace and the idea of responsibility. And we've touched on this idea that, you know, it should not all fall on the person with a disability. It is work that needs to be carried. And so looking at a typical workplace where you've got the employer, the manager, the supervisor, colleagues, folks with disabilities, where do you see like the sharing of responsibility?
I'm such a big proponent of both top down and bottom up. I mean, in reality, I don't love hierarchical structures, but I also understand that workplaces are very hierarchical in structure. And so I think that the key here is that at the top of the organization, at the leadership level, you have people who are saying, we are welcoming this work, we are welcoming these changes, and we are here to implement the policies and the practices and to make sure that you are actually feeling welcome and included and like you have access. But then that doesn't mean that a colleague who is somewhere in the middle of that hierarchical structure doesn't also have that responsibility to make sure that if they are leading a meeting or an event, if they are engaging with a coworker, right, that they are also doing what they can to create access. And I never want the burden of education to fall onto disabled people. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of value in practicing advocating for yourself and really speaking up about what it is that would make something more effective and comfortable and accessible for you. And that's a big ask, especially if the organizational culture doesn't really feel like you are safe to do that, which is why I say it's top down and bottom up. It's going to have to happen simultaneously, where you have leadership saying, we are fully committed to this as more than just some kind of pilot project. This is actually a culture shift that we want to work on. And then you have people with disabilities who take those very brave first steps of saying, I would like to disclose in this moment that this is what I need to make something more accessible to me. And of course, there's, I always want to give the caveat, I'm not a lawyer, and there's very much legal ramifications around what it means to disclose a disability in the workplace and formally request accommodations. And so I'm not suggesting that anybody in a position of leadership ask any sort of invasive personal questions, but I also don't think that it hurts to say, more broadly, how can I make something accessible to you? There's no real assumptions in that question. The only assumption is that you can't assume anything and you need to ask. And I think that that tends to be a great way to begin the dialogue.
Absolutely. I also hear in what you're saying, Emily, it requires a humility on the part of leadership, because depending on people's education, work experience, training, how you get, I'm just imagining JCCs. People in leadership come from all different backgrounds. Some may have, master's degrees in human resources. Some have come from Jewish communal work, recreational work. I mean, like, people get to this profession in all different ways. And honestly, training around disability inclusion and accessibility may be totally new and not have been a part of anyone's formal training. So this idea that, to show yourself as a leader and to acknowledge that in this non-hierarchical way, that there may be people on the staff, self-advocates and others that you're learning from, feels to me, and from what I've seen, very, very important.
I appreciate you naming that, because I think it's a reminder that we're all growing here a little bit. And I also think this is a really, really good opportunity to point out that you don't have to go it alone, as we were talking about before. If you feel like you need support, there are people with disabilities who do consulting work. There are people with disabilities who create all kinds of resources that are available. And so my hope is just that if you're feeling overwhelmed in where to start, that is that moment to feel a little bit humble. And that's something I feel constantly. I am constantly reminded how much bigger than any one person this work is, but that also means that there's a community to turn to and to learn from.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And begin with Emily's book. Okay. Last commercial of the day. No, I'll come back and do more. So, I know that one thing that many organizations do is to have an inclusion or diversity statement. And it's something perhaps they've worked internally, have on their website and in other public places. What do you think about this step as an important step?
For me, I am a big fan of being very explicit about your commitment. And so if you can name that, that's fantastic. So long as it's not only a statement that you've put on your website, but it actually is backed up with action. And the other thing, I think this is an important thing to name as well, is when I see inclusion and diversity statements, I so often see the term ability instead of disability. And I do understand that there's, that hesitancy to use the term disability. But what you're doing, if you were saying, we don't discriminate based on ability, fantastic. I would hope you wouldn't. But also, you're not specifically naming the community or the identity group that you are trying to reach in that moment. And I know that because of our history, disability is a very fraught term for a lot of people. It's not something that has always brought a sense of pride to people. It's something that carries a weight of stigma and discrimination. And so I really urge people who are putting out statements of inclusivity to not shy away from saying the term disability and from acknowledging we welcome disabled people here. We recognize and do not discriminate based on disability. And then once you've got that statement, put that action behind it.
Thank you. And thank you for giving that full picture. I encounter that with a lot of the organizations that I work with, be they synagogues or other Jewish organizations who are working through that, that statement. And exactly what you said, Emily, there's a weight to the word, just to the word disability, and that unpacking of it, to understand the importance of it and being able to say it, and to hear from people in that community. I think it's really important. So in this process that, we've identified that different workplaces, different organizations are in process. If you have an organization that wants to highlight their commitment to inclusion, but they're worried because, or concerned because they're not as far along as they want to be. They don't have all of their practices being like fully inclusive yet. How do they communicate or highlight where they are in this moment?
This is where I am all about radical transparency. I would very much rather somebody say to me, we're not there yet, but we care about it and we're working on it, rather than either A, ignore it completely, or B, act as though because they've implemented a little bit of access, that means that they've done the work. So, I think it's really okay to exist in those messy gray areas that we are often very uncomfortable existing in, and naming actively that we are figuring it out. There's a quote that one of my colleagues uses a lot: building the plane while flying it. And, as scary as that sounds when you think about it, I also think it really fits, because the reality is we are going to have to do a lot of building, but we're also going to have to keep moving forward. And so there needs to be a balance in how we're figuring that out. And as long as we are willing to say, we are working on it, we do care about this, and also we want your feedback along the way, I think that that is a great way to signal a stronger commitment. The most important thing, though, is, as I mentioned about feedback, opening those pathways for feedback. So highlighting your commitment doesn't mean that you have to have everything done, but it should mean that you are offering a pathway where people can feel safe to come to you, to speak up, to submit something anonymously even, that says, this is where I feel like we can improve. This is where I feel like we can expand our practices. And then receive that feedback with an open heart and an open mind, and apply it moving forward. So for me, commitment doesn't need to be black and white. You don't need to go from 0 to 100. You just need to be transparent that you are on that journey.
I think that is another really practical takeaway that people can leave with, that I think transparency is a value that is not held up high enough in our workplace cultures. And I go with humility and transparency, really so important to be able to just disclose the process.
And both of those things are often not associated with strengths. I think that is something that is really important to name as well. When we are thinking about strengths and weaknesses, if we are humble and if we are transparent, then that means revealing a lot more of ourselves than we may be comfortable with. And I know that can be really, really challenging. It's something that I struggle with regularly, but I also think that when we begin to embrace transparency and humility and recognize that we're all on a learning process, even within the hierarchical structure of a workplace, that is where the change starts to happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, it really is a paradigm shift or change. Again, both in terms of leadership and the values that we hold in the workplace. So yeah, this is a question that I think has gone through our conversation, but I want to ask it to you, Emily, because I think it's important to make it explicit, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions, because I'm sure folks, there's a lot percolating here. But in terms of this process of creating a more inclusive workplace, can you speak to the benefits of doing so for more than just employees with disabilities, but for everyone in the workplace, for all employees?
I'm so excited to talk about this because there's a concept that I really want to emphasize, which is called the curb cut theory, or the curb cut effect. And that's essentially saying, if you have a curb going from street to sidewalk, not everybody is able to get up it because there's a step. If you created a curb cut, then suddenly you've just opened up access for people using mobility devices, people pushing a stroller, kids on skateboards, someone rolling their luggage next to them. Suddenly everybody benefits. But also, even if you didn't need that curb cut, you can still use that curb cut. So you've now created a pathway for everyone to use in an equitable and accessible manner. this is the concept that I wish people would think about when they're thinking about accessibility everywhere, including workplaces. There is no such thing as accessibility that is going to somehow make it worse for someone else. There is, however, and I think this is important to name, sometimes conflicting access needs.
Yeah.
And I think this is a challenge that people can't quite overcome, where somebody needs something really, really bright, but somebody needs something dimmer because of sensory issues. Somebody needs a service animal, but somebody is allergic to dogs, right? So there are real conflicting access needs here. And so I want to name that, yes, creating curb cuts is fantastic. That is a fantastic way of thinking about creating access. But I also understand that in reality, sometimes it's not going to be quite that simple. And so it looks like having a dialogue, having a conversation, and figuring out where we can meet in the middle to meet everyone's needs. But on the whole, a more accessible workplace, or at the very least, a workplace that is mindful of the need for accessibility, is absolutely essential to creating an inclusive environment. And I actually want to name, I just saw in the chat, Tamar is absolutely right. This is a big one that I'm encountering now, and I should have thought to name it. Masking is very interesting for me because I am somebody who has a hearing loss, a pretty significant hearing loss. And so when I am talking with people, I do tend to look at their faces and kind of read cues and things like that. But I also care very deeply about masking, about protecting people. And so it's something that I and a lot of other people with hearing disabilities juggle quite frequently. And so, what are the solutions to that? Is it offering captioning? Is it offering interpretation? Is it using a microphone when you're speaking, right? There are ways to navigate these things. It's really just a matter of having that conversation. But on the whole, when you open up that dialogue, you are benefiting not just disabled employees, but every single employee by saying, we want to create a space that's welcoming to you.
Yeah, Emily, this is just hitting on a really important issue. And I see Tamar added in the chat, educating everyone to not decline the microphone or other things that might be helping others, for sure. So I want to pause for a moment. I have one other comment related to masking that came in privately in the chat to me that I want to give to you, Emily. But to say to the people who are on, if this conversation has you thinking about something specific related to your workplace, please feel free to put it on. I do want to name that reality that one person's accommodation could be someone else's barrier is something that I think can shut people down or intimidate people. And once you get into the mindset of like, oh yeah, that can happen, then like, even if it's hard work, at least it's not so scary and like shutting down. It's just, oh gosh, this is hard work and we have to be really creative. But someone wrote in the chat, Emily, about masking. You shared in your book about, how COVID hit the disability community very hard. And so in the workplace now, besides the hearing issue of masking, just that people are masking less and less. Can you speak about what we might need to do to be in solidarity with the disabled community?
So it's really interesting because I wrote my book very largely in the thick of everything with the beginning of COVID. I started the writing process in late 2019, and then I was in the corner of my living room, not going anywhere by, early 2020. And I was watching these events that were devaluing disabled people unfold in real time, and just devaluing lives and the value of a human life in general. And that was something that I really, really struggled to square. But by the time I sent my book off to the publisher, the pandemic was still very much ongoing, and I didn't really want to, write too heavily into it because I wasn't sure what the outcome would be. But I think that there's been a very interesting balance of outcomes. In some ways, there's been a silver lining for the disability community in the sense that we have opened up what I call virtual curb cuts, creating remote opportunities and really offering people a way to participate without having to show up in person. But then there's also the very scary reality that everyone is convinced it's time to quote unquote return to normal. And what does that look like? And I always urge people to think about how normal rolled out the red carpet for COVID in the first place. So I don't want to return to normal. I want to look ahead to better. And I think that the way that we're going to accomplish that is by having these very frank conversations about what access looks like for different people. And I know that with masking, people are very, very resistant sometimes one way or the other. And I don't think I have the perfect answer for that because I'm still trying to figure it out in different environments as well. But I also think that if it is possible to provide consideration to another human being without creating any kind of real toll on you, that we should be giving people that consideration. If there's a real access issue or concern that stems from it, have that conversation. But if it just comes down to something like putting on a mask or using a microphone to make something better for someone, and it doesn't in some way really take away from your quality of life, why not just do it?
Yeah, thank you for just putting that out there in a world that really, really needs that. I had my first airplane ride recently, and that was illuminating, not in a great way. So please, I want to just let folks know that you can raise your hand or you can put a question or a comment into the chat. I know that the masking issue is something that workplaces, Jewish organizations and spaces, everyone is trying to figure out, and it can feel really fraught right now.
It's an overwhelming conversation. And also, while people are thinking about whether they do have a question or not, I see some hands. I just want to drop in the chat. I know that when I have conversations like these, people tend to leave wishing for a starting point. And while I don't have all the answers and I am one person, I have a little resource list that I keep going on my website, and I hope that might be a conversation starter if you're looking for that with your colleagues.
Amazing. And I see Tamar has a question. Tamar, did you want to unmute and ask that or put it in the chat?
Sure. It was more just appreciation of when you asked Gavi about it's great to see you, Gavi, and it's so great to meet you, Emily. I'm a big fan of your book, and we bought the book for all of our staff actually as like a gift and a way to have more conversation around this. And I encourage everyone to do that because it really is so thought-provoking. There were a couple of things that I wanted to bring up. One was in answer to your question, Gabi, on what are the things we're thinking about or taking away from this. And one of the things that I think about a lot that was prompted by you, Emily, in your book and also in your talk today, thinking about the different perspectives that we hold and being sensitive to the fact that while I may be a person with a disability and I too am a person with a disability and white and Jewish and all of those things, that's not the same as someone else. And certainly not just like, gender or race or anything, but even the type of disability that I hold, like that, we think about that a lot. The question that I had for you, and this came up in your book and has been a point of a little bit of stress for me as someone who leads an organization in the disability inclusion space, and has been a point of pushback in conversations that I've received around word choice and word usage. And when we talk about not saying or worrying over, can I say, oh, I feel paralyzed by this decision, or, to use words that are criticized or deemed whatever it is, because it's a word that's a disability, but is being used in a negative way. And now I have some people saying to me, you're getting too like whatever about this. Like, that's not how we mean it. It's not, I'm not thinking about a person with a disability, what I'm using this for. Can you speak a little bit more to that, please? Because I need to strengthen my argument for this.
Yeah, and I just want you to know that you are heard and acknowledged on this, because this is something that I am accused of, quite honestly, constantly, is that I'm so overly language conscious that people are like, am I going to make a mistake around you? Are you going to call me out for saying the wrong thing? And no, I actually want people to understand that I'm not here to make anyone feel bad. I'm not here to call people out. I'm a big believer in calling in and just saying, hey, I noticed that you said something this way, and I just wanted to give you a heads up that may be a little bit difficult for someone to receive, because even if it's not how you meant it, there is the implication that disability is a bad thing. And it's all about not coming across in that very accusatory way. Not that I get that vibe from you at all, but I think that people really can feel like they're being accused of being a quote unquote bad person or bad ally because they've said something. I'm a big believer in giving people grace and giving people the space to grow in the language that they use and in their understandings of language. And so if somebody says to me, I'm going to turn a blind eye to that, or falls on deaf ears, I'm not going to get mad at them. I'm just going to take a moment, if the opportunity is right, to point out that, hey, maybe you can say this differently next time. And yeah, there's going to be people who are going to say, you were getting way too in the weeds here. That's not how I meant it. But I think there are also going to be people who will be receptive enough to it that you can start to see that gradual shift. So for me, it really just comes down to letting people know that I'm not trying to be the language police. I'm really just trying to invite a conversation about how things can be taken. And if they're not receptive to that, at the very least, I'll say, I understand that shifting language that you've used for maybe your entire life can be really challenging. But at the very least, I hope that you'll be mindful of it in the future. And if you say something that maybe is a little bit harmful, then I hope you'll just take this as an opportunity to do better next time, and not look at it as me coming after you, as me treating you in a negative way because of it. So I really try to give grace and meet people where they're at.
Thank you.
Very, very helpful, Emily. Thank you. And again, like a step, a process in those conversations. So there were a couple more comments. Let's see if we can get to both. I'm conscious that we are going to be wrapping up at 4. Ellen Goldman wrote something, and Ellen, you can unmute and clarify that if that's helpful. Ellen wrote, I would love to speak regarding the other end of the spectrum from an employee's perspective. And by the other end of the spectrum, Ellen, I'm wondering if you mean someone who needs more support in terms of an intellectual disability, being an employee, or if there's anything you want to clarify about your comment, feel free to put it in the chat or unmute.
I I'm not sure, an employee of the JCC in Pittsburgh. I was there 4 years, loved by parents, members, administrators, go up the ladder. I call it the ivory tower, which is where the executives are. When I was hired, I had a walker, and that was 5 years ago. As my problems progressed, I went to a rollator, and now I am in a motorized wheelchair. What has happened is this. There are 2 buildings at the JCC. I was in the smaller one. I was a front desk employee, part-time. I had no way of getting in the building. Absolutely, there was only one entrance and one exit. There was no button to push that the doors open. There were 2 doors, very heavy metal doors, and then a turnstile to go through. I also, and I did just what I was supposed to do. I followed rules. My back surgeon recommended me getting a different type of chair to support my lumbar. I put in the request. It went back and forth with questions about it. The chair was even broken that I was sitting on. Now, they finally agreed to a lumbar pillow. Chair was still broken. Okay, I was having still problems with it. That was the end of it. They would do no more. Now, all of these things, because I have different physical problems that, God forbid, I would have gotten COVID, would have been awful for me. And all right, I don't want to go into everything, but the few things.
Ellen, I think this is probably gives Emily a sense, and I know you can be.
That's what I wanted Emily to
Yeah,
hear.
let's do that. Let's hear Emily's perspective. I appreciate you sharing so much. And also I wanted to know, there was one other person who wrote a comment, Adam, and I know Liv will be in touch with you. So let's close with Emily's response for you, Ellen.
Emily, I just want to say to you now, I cannot say enough about you, and I think so highly of you. You're wonderful.
Well, thank you, Ellen. And I know it's hard to be open about some of the accommodations challenges and the challenges that we encounter as people with ever evolving disabilities in workspaces. And so, while again, I'm not able to comment directly on a scenario going on, what I can say is that I'm glad that you are doing what you can to kind of advocate for yourself, to navigate the situation. And I recognize that that can be, something that you need to kind of step into this bravery to do in a world that's telling you that you may not be as welcome, that you may not be allowed to take up space in the way that you need to take up space. And I think that's really the takeaway that I want to leave everyone with, is that we as humans all have that right to take up space in the world and to be a part of our workspaces, of our communities, of our congregations. And so if there's nothing else you take from this conversation, I hope that you will take the importance of doing your part and what you can to create a more accessible and inclusive workspace for everybody.
For everyone listening right now, please, you've got to be compassionate. You have to be. If you want the employee, you like the employee, you've got to be compassionate.
Ellen, thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it back to our hosts now.
Wonderful. Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined today and participated in this conversation, and a very special thank you to Gabrielle for moderating so beautifully, and to Emily for everything that you shared with us. This is such an important conversation, and I know it's one we could keep talking and talking for hours, and hopefully we will have that opportunity to continue these conversations in the future. And I really encourage everyone who's joining today to take some time to have a conversation with a colleague who wasn't able to join today, and share some of the things that you learned, and start those conversations in your workplaces. there's no time like the present to start, and it's never too late to really get these conversations going. So thank you to all of you for taking this time. I'm going to pop in the chat. JDAAIM is almost over, but there are still a few more days, and we have some excellent programs throughout the JCC movement that you can access on the JCC Association community calendar. I just put a link to it in the chat. Please take a look and see if there are any programs going on in the next few days that interest you that you could join in on virtually, and stay tuned for more information coming from JCC Association of programming continuing throughout this calendar year. February is the month dedicated to these conversations, but they're conversations that will continue and must continue to happen year round. So stay tuned for more, and please never hesitate to reach out if anything comes up that you would love to discuss. So thank you to everyone for coming.